Thanks. Thanks for making me feel really old. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. So, like Sebastian said, and thanks again for the intro, I want to talk about what APIs can and cannot do. So it's always a privilege to give a keynote, right? Because you're not supposed to really talk about anything in particular, right? You don't have to talk about any specific tech things. So what I want to talk about is mostly, I think, a little bit of level setting. What, on the one hand, if you're an API practitioner interested in API, what's very interesting in all the API tech stuff, but also to kind of give you a small list of things maybe to look out for, because in the end, we also have to make sure that the APIs are used for something useful, right? And if they're not, in the long term, we'll get into trouble because people will start asking us, what is it that you do playing around with all these APIs? So it's always, I think, important to also take into account that APIs, of course, cannot solve all your problems, and that's basically the topic or the theme of my keynote. So on my next slide, I have hidden a very subtle hint to my Twitter handle. There it is. See if you can find it. If you want to follow along the slides, I've posted the slides online. You can look at them in any browser. They run in the browser. So if you want to look at the slides now or later on, just go to my timeline. My latest or my second latest tweet has a link to the slides. Okay. So just a very, very brief intro about myself. So I'm a tech person myself. I studied computer science in Berlin. I haven't been living in Berlin for a very long time, but this is where things started for me, so to speak, in terms of technology. And I worked on web technologies and communication systems for a long time. And then for the last couple of years, I've worked in a couple of companies that really focus on API topics. So I worked with API Academy. Some of you may know that team. It has been around for quite a while. It doesn't exist anymore because of the transition that CA has undergone. And then I started my own company with a colleague, which we called Good API. And just recently now, I actually joined Xway, which is because I had to put the logo here. So now I'm with Xway and still working on APIs, right? That's what's dear to my heart. As part of working in the API Academy, we wrote a book. It was published late last year. It's about continuous API management. So what we thought was interesting and important in the API space was to make sure that people understood that APIs really are not just this one thing that you build and then it's there, but it's something where you need to have a strategy that's really kind of coherent for your whole organization. You need to look at the API landscape, that is what we call it, and try to make sure that this landscape actually delivers the value that in the end you hope to get out of these systems that you're building and the way how you're connecting them with APIs. Just a brief intro about APIs, how I see them. So of course, being kind of an API professional, right, you always struggle with how do you explain APIs maybe to not core technical audiences. My latest and current attempt is this, beer. It's good, everybody can relate to beer. And what I usually say about APIs, right? So APIs is just the delivery vehicle, right? So the API, so to speak, is the bottle, the tap, the can. It's not the value, right? The value is the beer, of course. But there's different ways how you can deliver it, right? You can put it in a bottle, that's nice. Maybe it tastes a little bit better, but it's heavy. You can put it in a can, that's a little lighter, but maybe you don't like the slightly different taste or whatever it is. You can have it on tap, which maybe is the best tasting variety of the product, but then again, you can't take it with you, right? So there's different constraints around how you deliver the product, but in the end, if you don't have good beer, it doesn't really matter, right? So I think it's always important to think about the fact that in the end, APIs are not about like having a value in itself. It's unlocking value that your organizations create somewhere and making sure that value can be transported between different parts of your value chain and to the end consumer. And since, if you have a metaphor, right, you also need to explain new things. So this is GraphQL in that metaphor. It's a mysterious thing. I don't know even whether that's a thing in Germany nowadays. Does Germany have these weird aluminum bottles? No? Okay, well. Bad move on my part, but you find those in America, right? So some people have decided that there's a cool new way to drink beer, which is to put it in bottles made out of aluminum. which to me makes no sense. But it's basically just a different way to deliver the same value, right? And to me, that's a little bit what GraphQL is all about, right? So GraphQL, in the end, might have some different constraints. It might have some advantages that other approaches don't have, or it has a different combination of properties that other approaches don't have. But in the end, if you don't have good beer, it doesn't matter, right? And there's a reason why I picked this brand, but I'll skip ahead. OK, so step back a little bit, digital transformation. So I've literally, in the last couple of years, I've traveled the world and tried to scare people about digital transformation, right? So we've delivered these workshops in all kinds of places. So these are all the ways how I try to explain digital transformation. I always say the same, it's just different places. This was in West Coast US, this was Australia, that was, any guesses where that was? Japan, thank you, Tokyo, right, of course. That's Europe, that's South America, and that is, where's that? Any guesses? South Africa, thank you very much. Yes, South Africa. So everybody's scared of digital transformation. Or everybody understands that they need to do it. And then very quickly, once you run into people who somehow see, oh, we have to do digital transformation, how do we do it, right? They run into this realization that, okay, we probably need to understand tech a little bit better. And I think this is where most of us, assuming that a lot of you are from a tech background as well, right, struggle a little bit, so to speak, and I think the business side as well. That to me, this is actually one of the nicest visualizations I've seen. It's very simple, of course, but that's what nice visualizations are all about. Talks just about, right, how digital transformation basically just means how technology becomes more and more central for your business, which means that both sides need to start understanding each other better, right? And that's challenging for both sides because by their very nature, business people maybe are not deep technologists and technology people are not deep business people, right? So, but it is something that I think is important to kind of absorb, right? That these things are moving together, and the whole idea of digital transformation to me means that you can do things together that you cannot do as easily if you are doing just things in a separated way, right? And very quickly, then I think you get to the point where, because it's hard to understand some of the details, where some technologies are being passed around basically, or some approaches, let's say, are being passed around as solving all the problems. And that's kind of where my talk really starts, right? So one of the things I've seen, so all of you, I guess, know this hype cycle, right? It starts with something becoming very popular. Everybody thinks, oh, this is going to solve all of our problems. And then at some point, everybody realizes, no, it's not. And then at some point, hopefully, this is not happening for all technologies, right? But hopefully, people start realizing, it may not solve all of our problems, but it's really useful. And that's something where, me being in APIs, right, I've tried to make sure that this is not too extreme. So what I've seen is this, right? People look at APIs, or people are being sold APIs basically as, do APIs and all of your problems are going to be solved, right? And then you come into some companies who then also sometimes bought our software, right, and said, hey, we're doing APIs now, why isn't everything great, right? And then you're trying to explain them that, yeah, maybe your APIs aren't great, or the rest of your organization doesn't really fit what you're trying to do, or you're basically just doing what you did before, only now you have APIs in between the stuff that you have. So why would that change things dramatically, right? So at that point, I think it's always kind of a risk that organizations have this idea that once we use APIs, all of our problems are going to go away. I don't know, it's a little bit dark, so this is a picture from Zoolander, a wonderfully silly movie with two not so bright lead characters. And just making the point, right, that just by using APIs, it's not that all your problems are magically going to be solved. And I think it's important for us in the API space to keep an eye on that and make sure that we tell everybody that there's a lot more that has to be done so that APIs can really deliver the value that you expect from them, right? So at some point, my role sometimes is to walk into the organizations, maybe that's not, and tell them, no, APIs are just plumbing, right? That's supposed to be some pipes, right? So APIs are not really sort of magical fairy dust that you put on your organization and everything works great. It's just plumbing. It's just a way to connect systems, right? And the value that you create is in how good the plumbing is, what kind of stuff you send through the plumbing to make sure that you can change the plumbing when you have to make sure that you can get it to the right people, that you can get the right stuff in, the right stuff out. That's the value, right? So sure, getting the plumbing right is important. If you don't, that's not good. But you still have to care about what you actually put through the pipes, right? And I think that is really then, once you start understanding that, you can start realizing the value of APIs. And that's kind of much harder work, right? Just starting to use APIs and just like, hey, we have an API, that's not bad, but it's not going to solve all your problems. And I think it's really important in organizations to always have an eye on the fact that the value of APIs can only be realized when you have an eye on what goes through the pipes, how are you enabling those pipes to be reconfigurable, to be kind of flexible sizes, right? To go to the right people, to get the right information in. And that's I think the important part. And I just want to walk you through a very, very brief sequence of things to look out for and what I'm trying to do. So who here knows Louie CK? Some of you do? Okay, so Louie CK is a comedian. I think he's wonderful. He's a little unpopular right now because he has a little bit troubled past, but still great comedian. And he has this wonderful format that's called "Of course, but maybe." And the way it works is he talks about these truths wherever he says, "Of course, this is what we want," and then the "but maybe" part is always like, "Yeah, maybe it's not quite that easy," right? So it's like this wonderful thing we all want and believe in, and then the "maybe" part where it's like, "Yeah, that would be nice, but actually the world is a little bit more complicated than that." And I want to use this format, "Of course, but maybe," just to walk you through a couple of steps and just give you an idea of how maybe it sometimes can be important to explain to people and to also have an eye on that APIs don't magically solve all your problems, but you really have to work on solving them using APIs, but not just expecting APIs will make them go away. Okay, let's start. So one of the things that people always talk about, like untangling monoliths. So of course, APIs are essential for improving modularity, allowing entangled IT systems to be decomposed into loosely coupled ecosystems and thus being easier to maintain and extend. Of course, right? We all want that. So we all have these monolithic systems, right, that people look at and it's like, oh, we have no idea what this thing is doing, don't touch it, who knows? And we all want to make them better, right? Because monoliths are tricky, hard to scale, maybe brittle, hard to change, right? So it would be nice if we could magically just touch them with the API wand and it would just decompose into wonderful modules, right? And as we all know, modularization is hard. It has been around for decades, long before kind of APIs as we know them were proposed. And if you look at the more general problem of organizational decomposition, right? How do you build organizations that are modular, states, empires, right? That has been around for millennia. How do you organize complex systems into well-defined parts? So it's a really, really hard thing to do, right? And APIs are nowadays way to do it. I totally agree with it. But it's really hard to do, so don't expect that to just happen by pointing some API magic at your monolith and getting a wonderfully modularized system out of that, right? So that won't happen. What will happen if you do that is you get a distributed monolith, right? You get a badly modularized system that runs in a complicated way, and that's kind of the worst thing that you can have, right? So think about that, yes, monoliths may be not always great, but decomposing monoliths is hard work, right? And APIs don't just make that happen. Next one, scaling up. Of course, APIs allow you to more easily scale IT resources by only scaling up those parts that actually need to be scaled. Of course, we all want that, right? Scaling is important. And scaling has been around for a long time. I don't know whether you can figure out what that is. Anybody recognizes what that is? Rohrpost, yes. Pneumatic mail, right? It's like these little capsules you put into tubes and they shoot around between different departments. So that has been around for a while, right? How can we build large organizations that pass around documents as fast as we possibly can, right? That goal, again, has been around for a long time. But in order to make that happen, right, we need a good loosely coupled architecture. It's going back to the monolith. And we also need to make sure that we can actually scale up things once we have a loosely coupled architecture. Serverless plays a great role there, right? So if we have, that's a big if we have good architecture and we implement it in serverless, we probably have a good platform for scaling, right? But that's a lot of stuff there before you can say, okay, now we can scale, right? So again, right, it's something where, yes, APIs will play an essential part in scaling, but it's not something where you can just magically scale stuff because somewhere in between there's APIs, right? Again, something to look out for where you can't expect APIs to do magic. Next one, monetization. Of course, APIs can be new sources of revenue, allowing cost-effective experimentation with digital offerings and creating new revenue streams beyond the traditional sources of income. Of course, who doesn't want more money, right? And so this is something, sometimes you walk into organizations and basically they say, we heard you can make money with APIs. We would like to use APIs, right? And then you try to explain to them, it's probably not the best approach to do APIs, to just expect, now you can print money because you have APIs. I paid for that picture, by the way. So please admire it. Okay. So, right, in the end, in most cases, making money doesn't depend on having the right delivery. It depends on having the right product, right? Yes, you want to deliver it in the right way, that you can actually get the product to your customer, but the important thing is the product, not the delivery, right? And APIs are delivery. So most organizations should really focus on the value they create and not on the fact how can we deliver it in a way and monetize that immediately. And in most cases, really, by far the most cases, it's not the right approach to look at APIs as we can charge for API access, right? In most cases, that doesn't work. In most cases, it's much more important to think about how can I improve the value I create by using APIs, right? Again, taking a step back from this rather simplistic starting point. Fourth point, communications. Of course, APIs are the way how to communicate in digital environments, and via APIs, all capabilities can easily interact throughout the organization and beyond. Of course, we all want this, right? We all want organizations that can talk to each other. So we don't want these organizations where nobody knows what somebody else is doing. So ideally, we want to be able to make sure that everybody can talk to everybody. But turns out, right, it's really tricky to make that happen, to have everybody talking to each other. Even if technically they can, they still need to know each other, find each other, understand each other. And that's a hard problem. And it's not a hard problem that just goes away by saying, oh, now you can use APIs. Again, APIs can play an important role. Pick the uptake of portals and these kind of things is a clear sign that organizations want to do that. But again, it's not something that just magically happens. And the last part that's connected to that is organization issues, right? So, and that's the hardest part, so I left it last, right? So organizational issues means, of course, APIs can help with improving the way how teams communicate and how the organization can innovate, of course, right? So this idea of Netflix and Google and Amazon and all these companies that are being passed around as poster childs for being very innovative and being able to do that because they use, in part, APIs, right? So you want all these different things. That's just kind of a random diagram of a complex service mesh. You want all these things to be dynamic so that teams can build new things without being held up by other teams, right? But again, if you do complicated things, organizing that is not something that just becomes trivial because you use APIs, right? So you have to make sure that you understand the complexity of your domain, and you don't expect that just because you have APIs, now everybody gets busy innovating, right? You still have to make that happen. And you have to make sure that you have the right structure in your organization, because Conway's law, that you probably all know, right, tells you that if your organization has like a strange organizational setup, that's basically the setup that you will find in your IT system, right? And you don't want that to happen. Okay, and with that, I have shown you all my of course maybes. And in conclusion, What I think is important to understand, and here I briefly have to switch to German because I think it's a better phrase in German, the notwendig, aber nicht hinreichend. I learned that at university and actually in logics, right? That some things are necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient. And sometimes it's actually a little bit hard to wrap your head around this because notwendig sounds kind of strong, right? But it's the same for APIs. In my mind, APIs are necessary but not sufficient for digital transformation. You have to make sure that you have the right approach and processes around this. So APIs will always require you to look at the business, the organization, and of course technology. We all know this, but we also should keep this in mind. And we also have to make sure that we have like a continuous cycle, right? This is what we started when I presented briefly our book of continuous API management, right? You have a continuous cycle of looking at how are my APIs doing. Are they realizing the value that I want them to realize? If not, what do I have to fix? How can I make sure that my organization actually aligns with what I'm trying to do in IT so that in the end the APIs can deliver the value that they theoretically can, right? And I think that really is the lesson that I want to leave you with, that for all of us in the API space, I think we work in a really, really, really powerful area that can change things dramatically. But we also have to understand that we have to make sure that we actually take all these other things with us. And we talk to the people who are not just into APIs. Because if we don't do this, we limit ourselves to just doing tech stuff that doesn't really matter as much as it could if we had this little bit bigger perspective. Okay, thank you very much. With that, I'd like to finish. Again, the slides are online. If you want to go there, this is the URI where you can find them. If you want to get in touch, feel free to ping me on various media or just talk to me here. Thank you very much. I wish you all a wonderful conference. I'm sure we have 2 great days ahead of us. And I think with that, I can pass on the baton to Jared, I think, is up next. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Erik, for of course, and but maybe things, yeah, because it really kind of sets the tone. Because it's cool to be excited about something, but on the other hand, it's good to be realistic, and hopefully this conference and lots of talks of this conference are going to help you. Let's switch over to the next keynote. Our keynote speaker for keynote number 2, setting the tone for the serverless architecture conference part of this combined conference. He's kind of a veteran in the serverless community. He co-developed the quite well-known serverless framework since 2015, as I learned. He's active in that space, and since that he, on the one hand, develops in the world of serverless and also helps organizations to move their mindset and to move their processes towards the serverless thinking. Please welcome Jared Short.
Thank you. I'll shake your hand. All right. All right. It's great to be here in Berlin, and I am excited to tell you about the serverless first mindset and how I approach both building serverless applications and working with companies to make sure that we're making the best decisions in our organization in terms of serverless, in terms of building applications. So my name is Jared Short. I did work at Trek 10 since 2015. Trek 10 is an Amazon Web Services consulting partner, advanced consulting partner. We specialize in building serverless applications. I also was one of the first people to contribute to what is now called the serverless framework. It was called something else prior to that. I worked at the serverless framework for a little bit as the head of developer experience. And now I'm back at Trek 10 helping people learn and build serverless applications again. I think I'm a little bit uniquely positioned to talk about this because I was also the first person that was ever Amazon authorized consultant and a Docker authorized consultant, and you can see how that went. What I want to do is, since a lot of us here I think are builders and doers and programmers, I like to kind of establish rules for how I build systems. So this is kind of the serverless first flow diagram, right? I have a design, I have an application I want to build. Can you make it serverless? If the answer is no, my response typically to those organizations and people is try harder. And if they say, okay, can you make it serverless now? And they keep saying no, I keep saying try harder. And eventually you get to a yes, or I just say, okay, this is clearly not worth doing, we're gonna skip it. So that's not necessarily true, but this is really, truly how I approach a lot of this stuff. But there is a few other rules that I like to put in place that make this a little more intuitive than just saying keep trying harder. So I would like to thank Erik actually for bringing up GraphQL. So the way we're going to talk about the serverless first mindset is I'm going to present you with various use cases, various real life things that I have built, that have shipped to production, and we're going to talk about how they were built and maybe why I would have done them a different way. So GraphQL is, of course, a way for modeling both how people access your data, so via an API, a schema, and it's also a runtime engine for parsing those queries and fetching data. So the way it kind of looks to a client, you have a well-defined schema, and they are able to pull in all of this information about your API. There's fantastic public tooling around GraphQL. It's easy to traverse that graph, and people can fetch exactly what they need. Your backend API understands exactly what people are asking for. You are able to pass back only exactly what they asked for. So GraphQL is, in my experience, a pretty great way to actually expose your data and APIs to people. But what about serverless in GraphQL? Why am I even talking about GraphQL here? Well, so serverless, you get all of these normal wins from serverless. So I primarily use AWS Lambda, but the serverless guarantees and wins really do apply to most of the FaaS providers out there, right? You get scalability and availability. You can do multi-region things. You get all of the power of GraphQL when you mesh these two things together. You get the capability for clients to ask for exactly what they want. But then once you mesh these two technologies together, really what you end up with is smoothing out some of those complicated and rough edges, right? So there's a really interesting kind of attack on functions as a service system, serverless systems, and then also GraphQL called resource exhaustion attacks, where essentially I can ask for deeply nested graphs with GraphQL, and I can try to make your systems take a long, long time to return me data. And at that point, it's both a resource exhaustion attack. You can try to chew up the amount of functions that someone might have available in their literal AWS account. If they say 1,000 concurrent functions, you can try to make sure that all of those 1,000 functions are running for the maximum amount of time, 30 seconds or something like that. And it's also kind of called a denial of wallet attack, where you're just trying to cost someone as much money as possible. So there's some really easy ways to mitigate that with GraphQL and serverless, right? I can just say, well, any request that's going to take longer than 5 seconds on my function is an invalid request, and we're just not going to return it to that person. And you get some really quick, easy ways around some of those complicated problems. And then also you get some complex resolvers. And we're going to talk about an architecture that I actually built. This is for a client that wanted GraphQL, and they had tons and tons of back-end systems that they were communicating with. So we had an API gateway that was actually running to a Lambda function that had a GraphQL engine in it. So this engine is, this runtime engine is parsing all of these requests coming in. And then behind the scenes, it would actually federate out to more Lambda functions. And these Lambda functions would go to DynamoDB, an actual relational database service. And so this was kind of one of those situations where it was maybe a little bit of a monolith that was distributed. So we got into that complicated distributed monolith situation that Erik talked about. But we were able to isolate some of those problems and say, just put another Lambda function in front of the REST API and we'll pretend it's now GraphQL. And to the perspective of the developers that were using this, and the people that were hitting this GraphQL endpoint, they didn't see all this complexity behind the scenes. We were able to add additional resolvers and additional ways that people were able to access their data without making it too complicated on the developers in the front end. So if I were to rate this architecture today, and we were to talk about it in a room with businesses today, I'd basically say, fail. This is a horrible idea. Don't do it. And the reason is probably not what you think. But this leads me to kind of my first rule of kind of the builder's creed of serverless that I have, which is if the platform has it, use it. So AWS has recognized that GraphQL is a really strong way to present your APIs to developers. So as they recognized this, they said, okay, we don't want people to keep necessarily building GraphQL behind the API gateway to a Lambda function with all of these other resolvers that are Lambda functions. Instead, they released a service called AWS AppSync, right? So this is a fully managed GraphQL endpoint where you just hand it your schema and they say, okay, here's your GraphQL endpoint. And then they give you all of these tools to do code-defined infrastructure, to do a code-defined GraphQL endpoint. You get all sorts of great security in place. It does all of the complex resolver stuff that I've been talking about. And really, in many cases, we get minimal code that we actually have to manage. So using that platform service, I'm able to reduce my overall risk and management burden on more complicated business logic that I don't necessarily want to be responsible for. So if the platform has it, use it, is definitely one of my first suggestions, right? You wouldn't build your own blob storage anymore. You would use S3 or Azure blob storage, things like that. So don't build it if the platform already has it. So the second thing I would like to talk about is kind of the hello world of serverless, of course, which is dynamic image resizing. And we were working with a client, and they said, okay, we have all of these images, and we need thumbnails. And then we need also maybe smaller versions for mobile. Maybe we need some other additional capabilities in an image resizing system. So using our use platform services, right? We wanted to make sure that we could leverage as many platform services as possible, that we weren't building too much business logic, and that we were handing off all of these complicated parts of an otherwise complicated application just to the cloud providers, right? We wanted all of the scaling, the security. We wanted less total cost of ownership. So, our shared responsibility model in the cloud. This is the traditional shared responsibility of the cloud, right? For AWS, they'll manage basically everything from their data centers, plugging stuff in, making sure it stays up the power, all the way up to kind of like base level software. And from there, then, it's the client's responsibility to worry about your networking configurations, making sure that you're using the correct server-side encryption, all of that stuff. This is complicated. And while this was a massive improvement over managing your own data center, it wasn't nearly as awesome as when we moved to platform services. Once we move to platform services, you'll see the red line. We get to stop caring about everything below that red line for the most part. All I have to really worry about is my applications, maybe some identity and access management, my customer data, and my business logic. So we're building this dynamic image resizing system. And I did some poking around, and as I was building it out, I said, you know what, I think I can do this in pretty minimal lines of code. I think it's worth us actually building this system. So this is not a live coding demo or anything. This is the only code slide, I promise. But this is legitimately what was running in production for a client, right? It's less than 40 lines of code, and we were able to build this entire dynamic image resizing system. People could ask for any size of image they wanted from a CDN, and they were able to get back that image. Now you'll notice there's like a lot of like logic that just isn't here. Like, okay, how are you checking for if the image already exists? How are you checking for all of that? Well, we were able to sit on top of a lot of platform services that already existed, right? So we used the content distribution network, CloudFront, and it would actually go and point to an S3 bucket, blob storage, and say, hey, is this thing here? If not, we actually leveraged a cool little trick inside of S3 where on the miss of an image, we could just redirect to API gateway. Once we got to API gateway, of course, we could run a Lambda function. So that Lambda function literally ran that 40 lines of code that you saw before, and we were able to have a pretty sweet dynamic image resizing system with 40 lines of code. There was, of course, some infrastructure as code managed in there, but our total cost of ownership was super, super low. In fact, our bandwidth bill, the first month that we ran this, cost more than the engineering time it took me to build this, which is saying something, right? We were able to build something for pretty cheap. Now, if I were to build this today, I would say this is a fail. Not because it's not technically capable of working, it works fantastic, and it's still working today. It does billions of requests today. But I'm not sure if I would actually take this approach again. And the reason being, rule number 2 of kind of the serverless builder's creed, which is if the market has it, buy it. As this system has grown, that 40 lines of code has grown tremendously because people started recognizing, oh, there's value in this. This image resizing system is bringing us lots of excellent capabilities, but now I want to put a watermark on the image. Now I want to grayscale it. Now I want to do all of these additional things to that image. And the engineering time that has gone into that has gone into improving it, well, it probably would have paid for at this point one of the like 500 different image media management solutions out there. So at this point, I wish we would have just looked at the market and said, is this thing going to address our needs right now and then also our future needs? So if the market has it, buy it. The third thing I want to talk about is real-time bidding. So we sat down with a client and they said, hey, we have this new project coming up. We have an existing bidding system where people are bidding on fairly expensive assets, 3,000 plus US dollar assets was like the minimum price of something that was on the service. And we have lots of vendors that are bidding on these assets and they're trying to buy them. So we sat down in a room and we said, okay, give us your business requirements. What are your requirements for this application? And they said, well, it has to support, hundreds or thousands of concurrent bidders. It has to have sub-second end-to-end bids, right? Meaning if someone does a bid here in Berlin on an asset and someone is sitting on their computer in the United States where I'm from, they need to be able to see within a sub-second latency that bid has gone through and it updates their browser. So people can have these crazy bidding wars with each other and they're just seeing these real-time updates. It had to allow for the easy addition of other services, right? So if they wanted fraud checks, bot detection, pull history of a bidder to see if they're within their asset bidding limits for the day or the week or things like that. Analytics so they could drive better decisions. So we sat down and said, okay, this is kind of complicated, but let's talk about it, right? Let's see if we can build an architecture that can address this with serverless. The initial things that they had brought to us were Kubernetes and Kafka and all sorts of crazy stuff. We said, well, let's put the brakes on for a second. Let's see if we can do this with serverless. So this is our initial architecture. Clients were communicating with API gateway, to a Lambda function, to a Kinesis stream. If you're ever building kind of like a real-time system or a streaming system, Kinesis is awesome. It's super scalable, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of events per second, totally possible through Kinesis. So we had built this whole system and we prototyped it. Stuff would come into API gateway, the Lambda function would trigger, check a user data store to see, is this user valid? Can we add some additional metadata about this user as we put it on the stream? We had an example of a fraud detection service with a bot, so off of the first Kinesis stream, we would do all sorts of other interactions with this future service box. We had some prototypes. We did all of this bid processing. So there was a problem. Our P95 of performance was about 1.2 seconds. And that's because we had, and that was from end to end in various regions. And that was basically the developer said, no, this is completely unacceptable. We are going to run servers because we have sub-second requirements. So we sat down, myself and a couple other people at Trek 10, and said, okay, let's get all of these metrics in place. Let's form essentially a war plan. And like Aragorn charging into battle, we were going to go to the business owners and say, you know what, let's do it, let's fight, let's talk about this, because we're going to make serverless work for you, whether you like it or not. So we had this interesting experience of sitting in the room with the developers and the business owners, and we said, okay, so we built this system for you. Here's what it looks like. It's massively scalable. It can perform for thousands of concurrent bidders. They click a button, someone bids, and it goes through. And someone might see it usually in like 600 to 700 milliseconds was about the average. But there's like a P95 of about 1.2 seconds. So not super slow, but also not what we were told by the developers. So we put this in front of the business owners, and then the one question we asked them was, so what's it look like today? What does this process look like today that we have sub-second latency requirements on the future version of this system? And they kind of all hemmed and hawed around the room, and they said, yeah, so they just like push refresh on their browser, and then they see the new bid. So we're like, so it's like 5 seconds, like how long does that page even take to load? And they're like, yeah, we don't know. So really, architecture was awesome, the requirements were a fail, right? So what someone had just arbitrarily said sub-second latency requirements because I need Kafka for my resume. So basically, my next takeaway and my next rule of the serverless builder's creed is, if you can reconsider those requirements, do it, right? If you can challenge what people have told you in terms of their business requirements, say, do you really need 50 milliseconds of latency? Do you really need a second of latency? Tell me your actual requirements. And if those are truly requirements, what are you willing to pay to get there? So this is probably one of my biggest tools that I have when I'm talking with organizations and trying to promote serverless, right? Let's talk about your business requirements. Let's face reality. And then let's say, okay, are you willing to spend 10 times more to get to 10% better performance? Usually the answer is no. So there are tons and tons of serverless use cases. Basically, all of this I've built in production. I have applications with various clients that we're doing billions and billions of requests per month, and all of these are completely valid. IoT is especially amazing for the serverless capabilities. So my final takeaway is, look, I get it. Not everything is a platform service. Not everything is on the market. And you definitely can't always reconsider those requirements and negotiate with those business holders. So if you have to build it, I want you to own it. At this point, this is truly what I would consider your special sauce. This is your business. This is your business logic. This is the thing that sets you apart from everybody else. And if you're going to build it, I want you to build it correctly, the right way, the first time, and make sure that you take ownership in that and you're proud of what you're building. So that's the serverless mindset, is really, this is where your value is. Focus on your value. And if you're going to build it, I want you to absolutely own that particular thing. I want CI/CD in place. I want testing wrapped around it. And I want you to make sure that this thing is able to stand out there on its own in a serverless fashion. So, serverless first. I have a design. Can you make it serverless? If you tell me no, try harder. Try again. And then finally, when we can get to that yes, do it. So thank you. My name is Jared Short, and this is the Serverless Mindset.
Thanks very much, Jared. Yeah, one could really learn that it's not about tech is supporting business some way. As Erik showed, really tech represents the business, equals business. Yeah. Also, with Jared's talk, this was pretty obvious. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think those two keynotes really set the tone for the following sessions to come over the next 2 days. The next sessions are starting already in 15 minutes. I'd like to know you that the expo is over there. Please visit also all the partners of this conference over there. There you also will find coffee breaks and lunch breaks and all that stuff. And also this evening, after the sessions, we also invite you for a small gathering, having some beer and some snacks and to chat a little bit. Yeah? And last but not least, do not forget to rate all the sessions and keynotes you're seeing here. And having said that, I wish you a great conference. Thanks for joining us, and see you later. Thanks.